Hello there and welcome to our channel, where curiosity gets comfortable and science settles into the slowest, gentlest corners of the mind. Tonight, we're wandering somewhere a little different, not into the future or the cosmos or the physics of something invisible, but into the ground beneath our feet and the memories it's been keeping for longer than our species has been able to write anything down. And before we drift too far into that, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Are you curled up in bed, half ready to drift off? Are you sitting on the couch, letting the day settle behind you? Or maybe you're somewhere in between, letting this voice fill the quiet. Wherever you are, I hope this becomes a peaceful place to rest your thoughts for a while. If you find this little journey soothing or interesting, or just a nice companion to the end of your day, it would mean a lot if you'd like the video and maybe subscribe. It helps this pocket of calm reach others who might also enjoy these quiet explorations, but only if you want to. No rush. There's plenty of time. Tonight's topic is the kind that sparks arguments over campfires and late-night conversations. Not because it demands conflict, but because it sits at the intersection of things people care about deeply: history, mystery, and the idea that our origins might not be as clean, simple, or well-documented as we've been told. The question we're exploring is one you've probably come across before. What if archaeologists are hiding evidence of the first civilization? This isn't an accusation. Nothing here is meant to be sharp or dramatic. We're not stepping into conspiracies with flashing lights or dramatic soundtracks. We're simply following a quiet thread that has existed for decades, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in debates, sometimes in the pages of books that attempt to fill the gaps left behind by the traditional story of human civilization. Because whether it's ancient structures that seem strangely advanced, artifacts that don't quite fit their layers of sediment, or myths from different cultures that echo each other across oceans they weren't supposed to cross, people have noticed things. Little things, uncomfortable things, things that don't always match the timeline we learned in school. And when people notice things that don't line up neatly, they ask questions. Some of those questions are perfectly ordinary. Some are bold, and some lead to the idea that perhaps somewhere out there, the very first civilization might not just be older than we think, but intentionally hidden, misinterpreted, or quietly brushed aside by the ones who are supposed to uncover the truth. Before we drift too deep, it's worth remembering that archaeology itself is a slow discipline. It doesn't run on the same timeline as most of modern life. When you're dealing with layers of earth that represent not years or decades, but thousands of seasons, you move carefully. You document everything. You argue over the angle of a single stone for months. And sometimes you find something that doesn't make sense, a tool that shouldn't exist yet, a structure that looks more advanced than its time period, a city buried beneath another city, which itself was buried beneath something older still. And every so often, one of those discoveries gets quietly filed away. Not because someone wants to hide it, but because it doesn't fit. Then the sheer amount of rethinking required to update everything else is overwhelming. Archaeology builds its story layer by layer, literally. So when a layer refuses to behave, the natural reaction is caution, a kind of scientific hesitation. But hesitation, when seen from the outside, can look like secrecy. The slow pace of the field can feel like silence. And silence can create room for the suspicion that someone knows more than they're saying, that somewhere tucked away in a museum drawer, or a research paper that never made it far beyond the academic circles, sits the thing, the missing piece, the object or structure or data set that could rewrite history. So tonight, instead of jumping into certainty or doubt, we'll take a different route. We'll wander slowly. We'll follow the threads people talk about, the strange discoveries unearthed over the past century, and the reason some stories rise to the surface while others sink quietly into the background. We'll look at what archaeologists actually do, what pressures they face, and why the very idea of hiding evidence even surfaces in the first place. And we'll ask what it would even mean for a civilization to be the first, in a way that challenges everything we think we know. But let's start gently with something simple. Imagine standing in a desert. The heat has eased. The sun is low. The sand is cooling under your feet. Off in the distance, half buried, there's a shape. At first, you think it's just rock. But as you move closer, it becomes clear that it's aligned, intentional. Not the work of wind or erosion, but something placed there long ago. Something built, something forgotten. And suddenly, you realize how easy it would be for a structure like that to disappear entirely under a single storm or a single century of shifting dunes. Multiply that by tens of thousands of years, and the idea of an entire civilization slipping quietly into the earth becomes not impossible. This is one of the things that fuels the question. The earth is large. Time is long. And erosion, storms, earthquakes, floods, volcanic ash, and the slow movement of continents have erased more than we will ever know. We're used to thinking of ancient history as something documented, cataloged, and etched in stone. But most of human activity has been built out of materials that don't survive. Wood, textiles, fibers, dyes, tools made of materials that weather easily. Even early stone structures can vanish under the right conditions. So when people ask whether archaeologists are hiding something, the question often masks a different feeling, one that has nothing to do with secrecy and everything to do with the uneasy awareness that we might be missing more than we realize. That the neat story of early humans learning to farm, then settling, then building cities might not be as linear as it seems. That maybe somewhere out there, in the layers beneath the layers, there was once a group of people who built something remarkable long before our textbooks say such a thing was possible. And the idea isn't entirely unreasonable. Breakthroughs in the past century have repeatedly shifted the timeline. Sites like Göbekli Tepe pushed back our understanding of organized construction by thousands of years. Discoveries of unexpectedly old DNA changed what we thought we knew about migrations. Ancient coastlines, now submerged deep underwater, turned out to have been home to complex communities before rising seas claimed them. Every time the story changes, it reminds us of how much more could still be hidden. But hidden isn't the same as hidden on purpose. This is where the question becomes more complicated. Because for someone outside of the academic world, when a puzzling artifact ends up labeled as out of context or unclassifiable, it feels like dismissal. When a strange structure doesn't get widespread attention, it feels like avoidance. When a discovery threatens to undermine established timelines and the response is slow, it feels like resistance. And resistance can look like secrecy, even if it's not. Archaeology is, after all, a human field. Researchers have careers, reputations, funding sources, and decades of theories they've invested their lives into. Overturning a foundational belief isn't just a matter of rewriting a line in a textbook. It can mean questioning entire frameworks. It can mean admitting that the thing you built your career around might rest on assumptions that were too neat, too tidy, too confident. So when an artifact seems too advanced for its age, or when a ruin appears older than it should be, the pushback isn't always about hiding the truth. Often it's about protecting stability, the structure of knowledge, the slow and careful process of scientific consensus. And yet from the outside, that looks a lot like a closed door. It's in that space between caution and curiosity that the concept of a hidden first civilization emerges, not as a wild claim, but as a kind of quiet possibility, something that lingers in late-night questions. What if we're wrong about the timeline? What if a society existed long before the rise of the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Indus Valley people? What if it left behind traces we misinterpret because we're not expecting them? What if some discoveries challenge existing ideas so strongly that they end up pushed aside, not out of malice, but out of discomfort? And what if somewhere out there, the Earth holds something so old, so unexpected, and so different from what we consider a civilization that we simply haven't recognized it yet? These are the kinds of questions we'll explore as we move through this story. Not with the intention of proving anything, but with the intention of understanding why the mystery exists at all, why people feel like something is missing, why certain discoveries spark wonder, why others spark debate, and why the boundary between known and unknown history sometimes feels so much thinner than we think. For now, let's just stay here in this quiet moment. The world is settling. The scale of time is widening, and the idea of a civilization lost to memory isn't as far-fetched as it might seem at first glance. As we continue, we'll follow the trail of the first question people often ask when they wonder about hidden history. Why do we, as a species, keep imagining that something came before us, something advanced, something forgotten? When people begin wondering whether the earliest civilization on Earth might have vanished or been hidden, the question often begins somewhere softer than suspicion. It starts with something human, a feeling that the story we have isn't quite finished. Not because anyone lied or covered anything up, but because the edges of our knowledge feel a little too clean for a world as old and unpredictable as ours. It's the same reason people keep returning to ancient ruins, myths, and forgotten fragments, not just for facts, but for a sense of connection to something larger than themselves. The idea of a lost civilization isn't only about stones, artifacts, or timelines. It's about the persistent impression that humanity has roots deeper than the ones we've been taught to notice. Part of this comes from the way we learn history in the first place. Most of us don't spend our early years hearing about thousands of cultures developing slowly across continents. We get a simplified version. The first cities appear here, writing emerges there, agriculture spreads from this point to that one. Everything fits neatly on timelines and maps. It's a tidy story because tidy stories are easier to teach. But as we get older and start seeing the world with more nuance, we notice that most things in life are not tidy at all. They twist, overlap, collapse, restart, and blend into each other. And once you realize that about everyday life, it's only natural to wonder whether the earliest pages of human history might share that same messy complexity. There's also the simple fact that humans are pattern seekers. We look for meaning in clouds, in constellations, in myths, in coincidences that probably aren't coincidences at all. So when we see a stone structure that looks oddly precise, or a myth that resembles one from across the world, or a tool that seems too advanced for its layer of earth, our minds reach for patterns, for continuity, for the possibility that these aren't isolated anomalies, but pieces of some larger whole, something that once existed and then faded, leaving behind hints rather than full stories. And because those hints don't fit the usual timeline, people begin to wonder whether there was a civilization before the ones we know. Something older, maybe even much older, something capable of building, organizing, and remembering, only to be swept away by disaster, time, or changes in climate long before recorded history began. This isn't an unreasonable thought. Modern discoveries increasingly show that human societies existed earlier than once believed. Not always in the dramatic sense of having skyscrapers or machines, but in ways that show complex thinking, collaboration, and creativity. The more we find, the more we notice how quickly knowledge can appear, disappear, and reappear in different forms. But the longing for a lost civilization doesn't come only from patterns in the ground. It comes from patterns in ourselves. Humans have always told stories about origins. Every culture has some explanation for where it came from, whether passed down through mythology, carved into monuments, or taught through oral traditions. These stories often describe ancestors who possessed knowledge or abilities that later generations lacked, beings who shaped the land, built the earlier structures, or guided humanity when it was still learning what it meant to be human. These myths are not scientific documents, but they often share themes across distances so vast that they shouldn't. Floods that reset the world, teachers who bring knowledge, cities that sink beneath the water, visitors who arrive after a great catastrophe. When people see these shared themes, It raises the question of whether they are simply stories or memories carried far beyond their original context. Of course, archaeologists generally approach myths with caution. They recognize that stories evolve over time, shifting as they're retold. But the average person hearing these echoes from place to place sees something different. They see a pattern. And when the scientific timeline doesn't fully explain those patterns, people begin wondering if something earlier existed, something that inspired these myths long before we wrote anything down. Another reason we long for lost civilizations has to do with curiosity. Humans are drawn to the unknown. Once we understand something, we tend to move on. But the unknown holds our attention. It gives us room to imagine, to explore, to question. And early human history is full of unknowns. We have fragments of pottery, half-buried walls, scattered bones, and sites that raise more questions than answers. We have enormous gaps between major discoveries, centuries where we find almost nothing, and then sudden bursts of complexity that appear as if from nowhere. These gaps are natural in archaeology. The Earth does not preserve everything. Most of human life has left no trace at all. And yet, when someone sees a gap, it's easy to assume something important might be hiding inside it. People also tend to assume that ancient humans were less capable than we are, as if intelligence somehow arrived gradually, like an update. But the truth is that humans have been fully human for a very long time. Even our oldest ancestors had the same capacity for creativity, problem-solving, and ingenuity. If you placed a person from 20,000 years ago into modern society and gave them a childhood here, they would grow up as capable as anyone else. There is no biological reason early humans couldn't have developed complex societies earlier than we assume, especially in regions that were later submerged or transformed by climate shifts. So the longing for a lost civilization isn't rooted in fantasy. It's rooted in the recognition that intelligence didn't suddenly appear at a convenient point in the timeline. It has been with us from the beginning. There is also something appealing about the idea that the story of humanity is older than our official records. It creates a sense of depth, a feeling that we are part of something much larger. People like to imagine that our ancestors may have known things we've forgotten, techniques for building, mapping, navigating, or observing the natural world. And in many cases, this is actually true. Indigenous cultures across the world retain knowledge that modern science is only now beginning to understand. Navigation systems based on stars and waves, agricultural practices aligned with ecological rhythms, architectural methods that respond naturally to climate. So the idea that even earlier civilizations might have had advanced knowledge isn't far-fetched. It's simply an extension of what we already know about human adaptability. But there's another layer to this longing that has less to do with science and more to do with psychology. People dislike thinking of themselves as the first. Being the first implies that everything was built from nothing, no guidance, no inheritance, no footsteps to follow. It makes humanity seem like an accidental flame, sparked late in the history of the Earth. But imagining that someone came before us, someone who wrestled with the same struggles, built communities, created stories, and perhaps even made mistakes we can learn from, gives us a sense of continuity. It feels like joining a lineage instead of starting from scratch. The longing becomes even stronger when we look at the natural disasters that have shaped the world. The end of the last ice age flooded enormous stretches of land. Entire coastlines vanished. The places where early humans lived were often near water, and many of those areas are now submerged under hundreds of feet of ocean. So when someone hears that, for example, a mysterious structure or an unusual artifact lies beneath the sea, it doesn't sound like fantasy. It sounds like a reasonable consequence of rising waters and shifting landscapes. And when humans see ruins beneath the water near India, Japan, or the Caribbean, it becomes even more tempting to imagine a broader pattern. Then there is the way archaeological discoveries actually reach the public. Most breakthroughs happen quietly. They're published in journals, discussed at conferences, and slowly incorporated into academic understanding. But they rarely make headlines unless they are particularly dramatic. Meanwhile, rumors, stories, and interpretations often spread faster than the original research. People hear about an artifact found out of place or a structure older than expected long before any official explanation arrives. And when explanations do arrive, they sometimes sound cautious or incomplete, simply because the evidence is limited. This creates the impression that something is being avoided, when most of the time, it's just that scientists prefer not to jump ahead of the data. Still, the gap between public curiosity and academic caution leaves room for imagination. And that imagination often fills the silence with the idea of a forgotten past, not because people wish to undermine science, but because they want a story that feels large enough to match the scale of the mysteries left behind. There's also a deeper emotional element. The idea of a lost civilization captures something nostalgic, even for places we've never been. It invites us to picture people who lived before recorded history as more than mere hunters or gatherers. It asks us to imagine them building cities, creating art, sharing knowledge, and perhaps experiencing their own rise and fall. It's not difficult to feel a sense of connection to that possibility. After all, every civilization we know of eventually decayed, broke apart, or evolved into something new. The idea that there might have been one before all the others simply fits into that pattern. Some people also find comfort in the thought that humanity is not as young as it seems, that our story stretches back further than 5 or 10,000 years, that we have roots deep in prehistory. And when we hear about unexpected archaeological findings, superior craftsmanship in places far older than expected, knowledge of astronomy encoded into ancient stones, tools that do not match the expected technological level, it becomes easier to imagine these as remnants of something earlier, something bigger, something that got lost. But curiosity alone isn't the whole story. There's also skepticism. Some people see the inconsistencies in the archaeological timeline and begin to question whether the slow pace of academic revision reflects something more than caution. They notice how controversial discoveries sometimes struggle to gain acceptance. They see how new theories often meet resistance. And in fields where reputation is everything, it's not surprising that young researchers hesitate to challenge long-held ideas. So the longing for a lost civilization is shaped not only by what people see in the ground, but by how they perceive the scientific world reacting to it. Still, the question itself, whether archaeologists are hiding evidence, often stems from a simpler truth. People want answers. They want the gaps filled. They want the story to feel complete. And when the available explanations do not fill those gaps clearly enough, the imagination steps in. When people imagine archaeologists searching for the past, they often picture someone brushing dust off a golden artifact or crawling into a hidden chamber lit only by a flickering torch. Popular culture has filled our minds with scenes of dramatic discoveries, buried scrolls, secret passageways, and symbols that unlock lost histories. But the real work looks nothing like that. And understanding what archaeologists actually look for helps explain why so many discoveries remain unnoticed for years, why some ideas take decades to gain acceptance, and why misunderstanding their process sometimes creates the illusion that something is being concealed. Archaeology begins not with treasure, but with dirt. It starts with landscapes, soil layers, sediment deposits, and subtle clues that hint at human activity. Most of the search happens long before anyone digs. Researchers spend months or years studying satellite imagery, surveying landforms, reading old maps, analyzing erosion patterns, and searching for slight irregularities in the ground that might indicate something artificial. A raised line in a field, a faint shape in a drying river bank, or a cluster of stones arranged in a way nature doesn't usually choose. These are the kinds of signals that catch an archaeologist's eye, and even then, nothing is certain. A possible structure can turn out to be natural. A promising site can reveal only a few scattered fragments. Entire excavations can take place without yielding anything that changes our understanding of history. Archaeologists know this, and they're trained not to assume too much from the first hint. That caution can be mistaken for secrecy, but it's really a necessary guardrail in a field where enthusiasm can sometimes run ahead of evidence. Once archaeologists decide a site might hold something of interest, they begin the slow process of digging. This is the stage most people picture, but even here, the reality is far more careful and technical than most imagine. Excavation isn't a matter of simply removing dirt until something appears. Every scrape, every layer, every shift in soil texture is recorded. Archaeologists document not only artifacts, but the context around them. How deep they were buried, what materials surrounded them, which direction they were lying in, how the soil changed from one spot to another. A single stone tool doesn't mean much if it isn't placed within its stratigraphic layer, its chemical environment, and its relationship to whatever lies above or below. This obsession with context is what allows archaeologists to build timelines. Without it, objects lose their meaning. A sophisticated tool in an older layer could suggest an earlier civilization, but a tool that slid down a crack, fell into a burrow, or was moved by ancient flooding ends up appearing far older than it actually is. Context helps prevent false assumptions. It also slows everything down dramatically. And that slowness matters. It's a large part of why archaeology feels incomplete. When researchers spend years carefully charting a single structure or analyzing a handful of artifacts, the public often sees only silence. But that silence isn't an attempt to hide anything. It's simply the necessary pace of a field where every detail matters. What archaeologists actually look for often surprises people, because it usually has very little to do with grand statements about lost civilizations. They look for patterns, repeated shapes, burnt seeds that show how people cooked, little fragments of pottery that reveal how communities carried water or stored food, tools that show how people spent their days, bones that tell stories about diet, migration, or trade, pathways that hint at how ancient people moved through the landscape. For archaeologists, a broken pot is far more valuable than a gold ornament because the pot tells them about everyday life. The gold object might tell a dramatic story, but the pot reveals how common people lived, worked, and raised families. This focus on ordinary objects surprises many people who expect archaeology to uncover civilizations through monumental achievements. But for the most part, early humans left behind small things: food scraps, stone flakes, hearth ash, footprints preserved by chance in clay that hardened before the next storm. Archaeologists look for these things because they survive. They are the most reliable clues to the deep past. This is important when we think about the idea of a first civilization. If a civilization existed long before the ones we currently know, its most durable remnants would not necessarily be grand structures. They would be the same kinds of things archaeologists already study: small tools, fragments of dwellings, traces of fire, bones shaped by human activity. And these things can be incredibly difficult to interpret, especially when they're buried deep under layers of soil or submerged underwater. The silent earth preserves far less than people expect. Wood decays, fiber disintegrates, leather vanishes, clay crumbles, metals corrode until they become unrecognizable. Even stone can erode into shapes indistinguishable from natural formations. So when people imagine archaeologists ignoring evidence of a lost civilization, they often picture something unmistakably artificial: a carved pillar, a perfect archway, an artifact that could not possibly be natural. In reality, evidence of earlier societies would be subtle. It might look like a scatter of stones that once formed a foundation, but now appear irregular. It might look like a strange layer of sediment that could be interpreted as natural unless carefully analyzed. It might look like a site that was occupied and abandoned so many times that its earliest layers are nearly impossible to isolate. Archaeologists rely on tools that reveal these subtle markers. Ground-penetrating radar detects changes in density beneath the surface. Magnetometry identifies patterns in the soil created by ancient heating. LIDAR strips away vegetation in digital form to reveal hidden shapes. Radiocarbon dating, geological sampling, and microscopic analysis allow researchers to build timelines from tiny fragments. When people wonder why archaeologists don't immediately recognize evidence of very ancient civilizations, the answer often lies in the limitations of these tools. Radiocarbon dating only works for organic material younger than about 50,000 years. Beyond that, dating becomes far more complex and uncertain. Stone tools can be incredibly difficult to date without context. Structures made of earth, which early civilizations often built, leave behind traces that can be mistaken for natural formations. This difficulty means archaeologists frequently need to rule out more mundane explanations before accepting extraordinary ones. If they find a stone arranged in a pattern, they must consider erosion, animal behavior, root growth, and geological processes before deciding it was placed by humans. This caution can look like skepticism or even avoidance, but it is how the field ensures accuracy. Archaeologists also look for human intention. A stone naturally fractured by freezing can mimic the shape of a tool. A rock face split by erosion can resemble a wall. A hole created by an animal can look like the beginning of a structure. To an untrained eye, these may appear as unmistakable signs of human activity. But intention must be verified through repeated patterns, where marks, residue analysis, and contextual clues. Without these, archaeologists hesitate to call something evidence of a civilization. Another thing they look for is cultural layering. Human settlements rarely exist in isolation. Even small communities leave behind a pattern of activity that extends beyond a single object or structure. Ash layers from cooking, garbage pits, clusters of tools, traces of food preparation, roads or paths, graves. If archaeologists found a single advanced artifact in an ancient layer without any surrounding evidence, they wouldn't assume a hidden civilization. They'd assume contamination, misplacement, or a misunderstanding of the context. This doesn't mean they ignore such finds. It just means they interpret them cautiously until more evidence appears. This focus on cultural layering also explains why understanding early civilizations requires broad excavation, not isolated discoveries. A rare artifact alone doesn't change history. A consistent pattern across multiple sites does. And building that pattern takes decades, sometimes longer. This is one reason the search for the earliest civilizations feels slow to the public. The pace of accumulation, careful excavation, careful analysis, careful interpretation, means that the story unfolds gradually. People may hear about a strange artifact or a mysterious structure, but without the surrounding evidence, archaeologists cannot draw sweeping conclusions. This can feel frustrating to those who want clear answers now, especially when the fragments suggest something extraordinary. Archaeologists also look for human signatures in materials. Burn patterns can show controlled fire use. Microscopic scratches on stone reveal the direction and purpose of tool making. Residues on pottery reveal what people cooked. These tiny markers help distinguish human activity from natural processes. But again, they require careful handling. Misinterpreting a scratch or stain can lead to incorrect assumptions about a site. The silent earth is full of these ambiguous traces. For archaeologists, distinguishing between natural and human causes is a daily challenge. And because of this, they spend more time disproving hypotheses than confirming them. If a stone looks shaped, they search for why it might not be. If a structure looks intentional, they examine geological records. If a layer seems unusual, they consider environmental causes. This cautious approach can give the impression that archaeologists are reluctant to entertain unconventional ideas, but it's simply the nature of a field where false conclusions can spread quickly and be difficult to correct. Another important component of what archaeologists look for is consistency across regions. If a lost civilization existed, its influence would likely appear in multiple places. People trade, migrate, leave behind tools, interact with the landscape, and spread ideas. Archaeologists look for these patterns, but they don't appear instantly. Sometimes one discovery sparks interest, but it takes years before similar evidence emerges elsewhere. This delay can be mistaken for suppression, but it's often just the reality of excavation schedules, funding, and the slow pace of research. Archaeologists also search for environmental data that aligns with human activity. Pollen analysis can show changes in plant life caused by farming or deforestation. Soil chemistry can reveal the presence of long-term habitation. These clues are subtle and easy to miss, but they are crucial. If a site shows signs of complex activity but no environmental change, archaeologists may hesitate to call it a settlement. This can lead to the impression that they are downplaying discoveries when, in fact, they are waiting for more data. The work is slow not because archaeologists want it to be, but because rushing risks misunderstanding the past. A misunderstanding can be just as damaging as ignoring a discovery. If a site is misinterpreted as evidence of an early civilization and later proven natural, it undermines trust. So archaeologists tend to move steadily, verifying, rechecking, and revising before they make claims. Of course, this measured approach can be interpreted in many ways. Some see it as careful science, others see it as reluctance, and a few interpret it as concealment. But in most cases, the silence people perceive isn't hiding anything. It's simply the space between excavation, analysis, and publication, a space filled with tedious work that rarely makes headlines. Understanding what archaeologists search for also means understanding what they often miss. Much of human history simply isn't preserved. The earliest societies may have lived in regions now underwater, eroded, or inaccessible. Many of their tools may have disintegrated. Their structures may have collapsed into shapes indistinguishable from nature. Their stories may have faded long before anyone wrote them down. Archaeologists can only find what remains, not what once existed but left no trace. When people imagine the possibility of a first civilization, they often picture something durable enough to survive. But durability is the exception, not the rule. And that makes the search especially challenging. When you begin tracing the human story back through time, something becomes clear almost immediately. The closer you get to the present day, the more detailed everything is. Entire civilizations unfold across centuries. Languages branch and evolve. Cities rise, crumble, and rise again. We have pottery, texts, monuments, ships, tools, and artifacts that map the daily routines of people long gone. But as you move deeper into the past, the details thin out. Names disappear, structures fade, objects grow simpler, stories vanish. And eventually, you reach a point where the timeline becomes less like a thread of continuous events and more like scattered islands separated by enormous oceans of time. These gaps aren't small and they aren't rare. They stretch across continents and eras. They sit between technological leaps, between population expansions, and between sudden changes in behavior. These are the strange holes in human history that so many people point to when they begin wondering whether something important might be missing. Not just missing in the sense of lost or undiscovered, but missing in a way that suggests the story itself might be incomplete. One of the first gaps people notice lies between the earliest signs of fully modern humans and the beginnings of agriculture. We know anatomically modern humans appeared more than 200,000 years ago. Their brains were as capable as ours. Their bodies were indistinguishable from those of people alive today. Yet for long stretches of time, the archaeological record shows only small camps, scattered tools, and hints of symbolic behavior. Then almost suddenly, art flourishes, technology becomes more diverse, and people start building complex societies. The shift seems dramatic, especially when you compress it into a simple timeline. It makes some people wonder why humans, with our level of intelligence, spent tens of thousands of years doing what appears from the outside to be very little. Archaeologists usually explain this through population size, climate shifts, and the difficulty of preserving early cultural evidence. And those explanations are reasonable. But from a broader perspective, the gap still feels strange. Humans with the same cognitive abilities as today spent most of their existence leaving behind almost nothing compared to the later bursts of creativity. That silence raises questions, not because we assume something grand must have happened, but because the contrast between potential and evidence feels too sharp. Another gap appears in the transition between nomadic life and settled communities. Agriculture emerged around 11,000 years ago, but the knowledge and behaviors that led to it seemed to arrive faster than expected. People who were once moving with the seasons suddenly settled, built homes, developed domestication methods, and created organized communities. Sites like Göbekli Tepe, which predates agriculture, show large-scale construction by societies that supposedly lack the tools and food systems needed for such projects. This contradiction sits at the edges of the timeline, like a puzzle piece from a different box. Then there are the mysterious disappearances. Entire cultures that thrived for centuries suddenly vanish from the archaeological record, leaving questions in their wake. Some of these disappearances have explanations: climate change, disease, conflict, or migration. But others remain unresolved. They leave behind the uncomfortable impression that societies can rise, develop knowledge, build structures, and then dissolve into the landscape so thoroughly that only fragments remain centuries later. When you stack these disappearances across thousands of years, you begin to see how easy it might be for a civilization to rise and fall without leaving clear evidence, especially one that existed long before most of the structures we study today were built. The further back you go, the more fragile the clues become. A structure from 5,000 years ago may survive storms, soil shifts, and erosion. A structure from 20,000 years ago has a much harder fight. One from 40,000 years ago faces near-impossible odds. This fragility explains another type of gap, the erosion gap. Parts of the world have been reshaped by glaciers, rivers, floods, volcanic eruptions, and rising seas. Entire coastlines from the last ice age lie underwater. Millions of square kilometers that once held communities are now inaccessible. Archaeologists know this, but the public often forgets how much land we've lost. When you picture a map of the world, you rarely imagine how different it looked 12,000 years ago. Vast coastal plains existed where there is now ocean. Valleys and rivers covered by water once supported life. Any evidence there, structures, tools, hearths, villages, would now be hidden beneath the layers of sediment and salt. This creates a blind spot. We know early humans lived near water. Freshwater rivers and coastlines were essential for survival. But most of those landscapes are gone. So when people look at the archaeological record and see gaps, it's not because no one lived in those periods. It's because we can't reach the places where they lived. The Earth has reconfigured itself repeatedly, burying entire eras beneath layers of transformation. Another major gap appears in innovation. For long stretches of time, early humans used nearly the same tools with very little variation. Then, over a relatively short period, innovations exploded. Advanced hunting strategies, fishing equipment, sewing tools, composite weapons, and early forms of symbolic expression. The jump feels abrupt. Some researchers attribute it to population increases, which allow knowledge to accumulate faster. But again, the scale of the shift raises questions. How did a species with our intelligence remain at a certain level for so long, and then leap forward almost overnight? This type of jump is often compared to the rise of the first cities. For thousands of years, people lived in small groups. Then, within a few millennia, large settlements appeared across different regions, each with surprisingly advanced organization. It gives the impression of a global spark, as if something spread or reawakened rather than slowly developed. Archaeology offers explanations, irrigation systems, trade networks, climate stability, but the pattern still looks like something missing earlier in the record. There are also strange gaps in technology. Some tools appear long before the supporting evidence explains how they were made. Blade technologies that show remarkable skill appear in places where the development sequence is unclear. Sites with early stone architecture appear without earlier local examples of experimentation. This makes it look as though certain skills arrived fully formed, even though archaeology teaches that technologies usually evolve gradually through trial and error. But perhaps the most discussed gaps are the cultural ones. Myths and oral traditions across the world mention earlier ages, earlier people, earlier builders. Some speak of nations before the flood. Some describe ancestors who mastered arts later lost. Others mention cycles of rise and decline. Archaeologists often see these as symbolic or metaphorical, but people outside the field note the similarities across cultures and wonder why stories from so many regions reference something that might sound like memory rather than imagination. Of course, oral traditions evolve over generations. They change shape and absorb influences, but they often carry remnants of real events passed down in indirect ways. When people compare these shared myths and see patterns, it encourages them to fill the archaeological gaps with something more unified. A lost beginning, a forgotten origin, a civilization erased from the visible record. Climate evidence also hints at gaps. At the end of the last ice age, dramatic shifts occurred. Rapid warming, sudden cooling, and catastrophic floods as glacial lakes burst and sea levels rose. These events reshaped landscapes suddenly, not gradually. They could have easily erased communities or settlements in their path. Geological layers from this period contain signs of turbulent activity, but often no direct evidence of the humans who may have lived through it. When researchers find these violent transitions, they acknowledge that human presence could have been entirely wiped away, leaving no clear archaeological trace. This realization deepens the sense that the timeline we have might be incomplete. There are also gaps created by preservation bias. Some environments preserve artifacts well: dry deserts, cold tundra, stable caves. Others destroy almost everything: humid forests, wetlands, coastal areas. If a civilization developed in a region that does not preserve material well, almost nothing would survive for archaeologists to find. And if that civilization moved, migrated, or changed its settlement patterns, its remains could be scattered too widely to form a clear picture. So when people ask why we haven't found the earlier civilization, one answer might be simply that we're looking in places where survival of evidence is least likely. Another consideration is time depth. The older a site is, the harder it becomes to interpret. Soil shifts, layers compress, artifacts move, entire geological periods overlap. A stone structure from 15,000 years ago might be buried under meters of sediment or altered by natural forces until its human origin becomes nearly undetectable. Archaeologists face the challenge of distinguishing ancient human activity from the Earth's relentless processes. When the clues are faint, interpretation becomes uncertain, and uncertainty creates room for questions. A different kind of gap arises from the unevenness of research. Some regions of the world have been studied intensively, others have barely been touched. Political instability, limited funding, difficult terrain, and restricted access all slow the search. Vast areas of Africa, the Amazon basin, Siberia, Southeast Asia, and remote islands remain barely explored archaeologically. And underwater archaeology, the place where many early settlements likely rest, is still in its infancy due to cost and technical challenges. When you realize how much of the planet remains unexamined, the gaps in the timeline begin to feel less like mysteries and more like untouched chapters. Still, even with all these explanations, the gaps maintain a certain pull. They feel like quiet spaces where anything could fit. People don't fill these gaps with speculation because they reject archaeology. They do it because the gaps exist, and the imagination naturally tries to complete the picture. When the known pieces of the timeline feel scattered, the mind reaches for something that ties them together. Some people suspect that archaeologists downplay discoveries that don't fit the accepted timeline. But more often, the problem isn't suppression, it's interpretation. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and early sites rarely provide strong clarity. A single structure cannot rewrite history. A single artifact cannot prove a long-lost civilization existed. Multiple sites with consistent evidence are required. And because the earliest layers of time are so fragile, building the consistency takes patience. Still, the gaps remain, and they matter. They remind us that the story of humanity is not as continuous as our timelines suggest. They hint at the fragility of early evidence and the vast stretches of prehistory we have yet to uncover. They create space for curiosity, prompting people to ask questions archaeology cannot yet answer. For a long time, when people thought about ancient civilizations, they imagined deserts, mountains, jungles, or plains, places where ruins rise out of the earth, where stones peak above shifting sands, where walls remain just intact enough to hint at their former purpose. But in the last few decades, something has shifted. The story has expanded. More people have realized that a large part of human history might not be buried under soil at all. It might be underwater. The oceans hold most of Earth's forgotten landscapes. During the last ice age, enormous amounts of water were locked in glaciers, leaving sea levels much lower than today. Coastlines stretched far beyond their modern boundaries. Rivers carved paths through land now submerged. Plains and valleys existed where waves now move in slow, unseen patterns. And those coastlines were the perfect places for early humans to live. They were rich in resources, mild in climate, and predictable in their rhythms. If early communities built settlements, farms, or gathering places, chances are many of them were near those long-lost shores. When the ice melted and the sea rose, these places disappeared. Not suddenly, like a dramatic tidal wave sweeping away entire cities, but steadily over centuries. A village might have noticed the shoreline creeping closer year after year. Families might have relocated little by little. Generations might have watched their homes reclaimed by the water. And eventually, everything they built, everything they laid down in stone or wood or clay, became part of the seafloor. Archaeology on land is already slow and difficult. Underwater, the difficulty multiplies. Visibility changes with tides. Currents shift sand across the seabed. Artifacts sink, drift, scatter, or become buried. Structures collapse under pressure or become encrusted with marine life until they resemble natural formations. And because underwater excavation requires specialized equipment and funding, most of the world's shallow seas, and almost all of its deeper waters, remain unexplored. This leaves us with a vast, quiet expanse of mystery, an area far larger than everything we have ever dug on land combined. When people talk about missing civilizations, they often imagine grand structures swallowed by the sea. But the truth is both simpler and more surprising. Entire chapters of the human story could lie in places no one has ever seen, not because anyone chose to hide them, but because the ocean is enormous and our ability to study it is small. Some of the most intriguing clues come from places where coastlines used to stretch outward. In those areas, divers have found stones arranged in patterns that do not resemble geological formations. They found walls, steps, foundations, and roads, all beneath meters of water. Some of these discoveries are well known, others less so, but each of them changes how we think about the past. One example comes from the coast of India, where divers exploring the Gulf of Combat reported the remains of a settlement resting beneath roughly 40 meters of water. The structures appear to be arranged in grids, with geometric layouts suggesting intentional planning. Radiocarbon samples associated with the site suggested ages older than the earliest known cities. But the evidence was complicated. Strong currents disturbed the layers, making it hard to determine what belonged to the site and what drifted in from elsewhere. Debates formed. Some researchers dismissed the findings as natural. Others insisted the shapes were too structured to be accidental. The controversy remains unresolved, not because anyone is hiding the truth, but because interpreting evidence underwater is incredibly challenging. The ocean moves things, mixes layers, and changes context in ways we cannot fully predict. Then there's the submerged city off the coast of Japan, often called Yonaguni. Photographs of the massive stone formations show terraces, steps, pillars, and flat surfaces that look almost manufactured. Some geologists say the features formed naturally over thousands of years. Others argue that the shapes are too precise to be natural, pointing to right angles, straight walls, and flat plains that seem unusual for erosion alone. Once again, the ocean complicates the story. If the formations were originally natural but modified by humans, the evidence could easily be obscured. If they were entirely natural, the resemblance to human architecture is uncanny. The debate continues, not because anyone wants to mislead the public, but because the line between geological and human activity becomes increasingly blurred underwater. There are also smaller finds that rarely reach wide audiences. Simple stone tools discovered on submerged land bridges. Hearth remains found in what used to be ancient river valleys. Bones of animals that were hunted and butchered along coastlines that no longer exist. None of these discoveries point to a forgotten empire or sophisticated city, but they demonstrate that people lived along coastlines much earlier than previously understood. And if people lived there, then some of what they built must lie under the waves today, waiting to be found. One of the most compelling underwater discoveries comes from the Black Sea. Researchers have found traces of ancient coastlines far below the modern shoreline, along with signs of human habitation. Sediment layers suggest a dramatic flooding event thousands of years ago, a slow, relentless rise that transformed the region. The people living there would have had no choice but to move. Their settlements, their tools, and their daily lives were left behind, swallowed by rising waters. The floors of those ancient valleys now lie deep beneath the surface in areas difficult to excavate. The discoveries made so far are only the edges of a much larger picture, a reminder of how much we might still uncover. Even more striking is the realization that almost every ancient culture left some trace of rising seas in its stories. Flood myths appear across the world, not as identical stories, but as shared memories of a time when water reshaped the land. Archaeologists often interpret these myths as symbolic. But as sea level studies advance, it becomes clear that many of them reflect real events. When people see these global patterns, they naturally wonder whether the floods erase not just villages, but entire civilizations. Another place where evidence hides is along continental shelves. These regions were once vast plains where early humans likely farmed, built shelters, and formed communities. Today, these plains sit underwater, packaged in darkness and pressure, unreachable without advanced technology. The world's continental shelves cover more than twice the land currently exposed above sea level. This means that a significant percentage of human history lies underwater, untouched. Researchers who use modern scanning technology occasionally find peculiar shapes, straight lines, rectangular patterns, circular depressions. Most of these shapes turn out to be natural upon closer inspection. But every so often, one looks unusual enough that it lingers in the minds of those who study it, not because it proves the existence of a lost civilization, but because it suggests human activity may have once existed in places we're only beginning to explore. People often assume archaeologists ignore these hints, but the reality is different. Underwater archaeology is expensive. Funding is limited, Exploration requires specialized teams, equipment, and time. And even when promising sites are located, storms, currents, and shifting sands can bury them again within weeks. Researchers often return to a site only to discover it changed completely. These natural challenges create the impression that the ocean keeps its secrets intentionally, as if reluctant to give them up. Another aspect of underwater mystery comes from the difficulty of context. On land, layers of soil act like a timeline. The deeper something is buried, the older it tends to be. But underwater, layers mix. Waves churn sediments. Currents carry artifacts from one place to another. Without clear stratigraphy, it becomes harder to determine whether something is ancient, recent, or displaced. So even when divers find objects that seem out of place, dating them accurately becomes nearly impossible. This does not mean underwater discoveries have no value. They do, that they often raise more questions than answers. People outside the field see this uncertainty and interpret it as secrecy. They imagine archaeologists withholding evidence. But in most cases, the issue isn't withholding, it's waiting for more data. Scientists avoid conclusions when the evidence is too fragile. They prefer slow certainty to quick speculation. Yet the gaps left by this cautious approach feed curiosity. When a diver shares a photograph of what looks like a staircase under the sea, people don't think about erosion patterns or geological fractures. They think about who might have built it. When sonar imaging reveals shapes that resemble roads or walls, the imagination steps in long before studies are complete. These reactions aren't unreasonable. They're part of our natural desire to fill the unknown with possibilities. There's also the fact that underwater discoveries create a different kind of emotional response. The idea of something built by humans now resting beneath the waves stirs something in people. It feels quiet, isolated, mysterious. The ocean is already a place filled with hidden life and unseen landscapes. Adding ancient human history to that mix makes it feel even more alive. It's easy to imagine a civilization wiped away by rising waters, its stones slowly settling into place on the seafloor, while the world above forgets it existed. Some researchers believe evidence of early civilizations may be preserved in underwater caves. These caves, sealed from currents and protected from erosion, can act as time capsules, but they are difficult and dangerous to explore. Only the most skilled divers can reach them, and even then, the visibility and access remain limited. Inside these caves, archaeologists have found footprints, tools, bones, and art that date back tens of thousands of years. If early humans created more complex structures or artifacts, these caves might hold them, waiting for future exploration. The ocean also hides rivers, lakes, and entire landscapes frozen in time. Imaging technology has revealed river beds that look almost exactly like the ones on land today. Meandering paths, deltas, and channels carved when the world looked very different. People lived near these rivers. They hunted, gathered, and possibly built simple structures. If any evidence remains, it sits quietly at the bottom, covered in silt. Every year, new underwater discoveries appear in scientific journals, but only a handful reach the public. Not because they're hidden, but because they lack the clarity that makes for an easy headline. A structure that might be artificial, but might not be, doesn't spark the same attention as a definitive announcement. So the ocean's potential remains largely invisible to most people, even though researchers know how much lies beyond their reach. And this sense of unreachability is part of why the ocean feels like the perfect place for a forgotten civilization, not because it guarantees one existed, but because it explains how something could have existed without leaving much behind. The world changed dramatically at the end of the last ice age. Coastlines shifted, weather patterns transformed, land disappeared. If early societies organized themselves in those regions, their evidence would now lie in places difficult to study and harder to interpret. The ocean doesn't hide things out of intent. It hides them because that's what water does. It reworks the land. It smooths edges. It preserves some things and destroys others. And underwater sites require a level of patience and precision that archaeology is only beginning to develop on a large scale. When people first hear that myths from different cultures share common themes, it often sounds like coincidence. Stories drift, travelers carry ideas, and human imagination tends to circle familiar patterns. But once you start listening closely to myths from around the world, something begins to stand out. There are details woven into these stories that don't behave like ordinary imagination. They sound instead like memories, memories so old they've turned into narrative, memories that have survived in the only way fragile knowledge can survive when nothing physical remains. Myths are often dismissed as symbolic or metaphorical, and sometimes that's true, but they also act as containers. Cultures use stories to hold on to information, warnings, histories, cosmologies, migrations, and explanations for events no one alive at the time can remember firsthand. When you realize that myths take on a different kind of weight, they stop being fantasy and start looking like lessons wrapped in images. And some of those lessons appear across continents separated by oceans and time. One of the most common themes found in cultures that had no known contact is the memory of a world that changed suddenly. The water rose, the land shook, the sky darkened, a great flood swept across the world. People retreated to high places, or fled in boats, or were guided by figures who knew what was coming. Many societies share this kind of story, not as a vague metaphor but with concrete details. The loss of coastal lands, the destruction of cities, the disappearance of a people who once lived before. Archaeologists often explain these stories as exaggerations of local events, rivers flooding, tsunamis striking, storms destroying settlements. And sometimes that's correct. But climate research shows that between 12 and 8,000 years ago, sea levels rose dramatically. Not slowly the way we imagine gradual climate shifts, but in sudden pulses. Glacial lakes burst. Ice sheets collapsed. Coastlines retreated by kilometers. Entire plains vanished. The people who lived during those times would have witnessed landscapes disappear within a generation. For them, the flood was real, not mythic. It happened. When people from different continents describe a great flood, it might simply be because humans everywhere live near water. But when they describe not just a flood, but a civilization before the flood, an organized society, a group of ancestors with knowledge that later generations could not match, the similarity becomes harder to ignore. Some cultures speak of teachers who arrived after a catastrophe. Figures who brought knowledge, taught agriculture, shared astronomical understanding, or instructed communities on how to rebuild. These figures have different names across regions, but the pattern is consistent. In Mesopotamia, the stories speak of sages who emerge from the sea. In the Andes, a tall figure in white taught people after a great collapse. In parts of Asia, ancient texts describe a time when people relearned skills lost in a previous age. These figures are not gods in the traditional sense. They are described as people, unusual, advanced, or simply more knowledgeable than the survivors they encountered. Archaeologists view these stories through the lens of cultural development, often seeing them as symbols of internal innovation rather than external influence. And that interpretation works in many cases. But for people outside the field, the similarities across regions raise questions. Why do stories from distant cultures describe knowledge being reintroduced rather than invented? Why do they reference a time before, a society that fell, or a memory of something more organized than hunter-gatherer groups are assumed to have been? Another theme found across continents is the idea of cycles. Not a single beginning, but many. A world built and destroyed, rebuilt and destroyed again. People rising to sophistication, falling into hardship, and rising once more. These cycles appear in ancient India, in Greek philosophy, in indigenous American traditions, in Pacific Islander narratives, and in Egyptian cosmology. They describe ages of humanity, each one ending in disaster: fire, water, darkness, cold, followed by renewal. It's easy to interpret these cycles symbolically. They reflect the natural rhythm of life, but they also mirror the geological record. Ice ages begin and end. Volcanic eruptions disrupt entire climates. Meteor impacts array species. Sea levels rise and fall, and humans living through these shifts would understandably encode them into their cultural memory. One of the more surprising examples of myth preserving real knowledge comes from indigenous Australian communities. Some of their oral traditions describe shorelines that existed more than 7,000 years ago, based on stories passed down through countless generations. When researchers compared these stories to geological data, they found accurate descriptions of submerged landscapes. This realization changed how many anthropologists view oral tradition. It demonstrated that stories can carry precise factual memory across huge spans of time. If some myths preserve accurate details of coastlines lost millennia ago, then perhaps other myths preserve memories of events, cultures, or knowledge from even earlier periods, not as literal accounts, but as impressions, compressed, transformed, and wrapped in symbolism, but still echoing real experiences. One of the most debated pieces of mythic memory belongs to Plato's account of Atlantis. People often focus on the dramatic aspects: an advanced society, a sudden destruction, the city sinking beneath the sea. But the context is more subtle. Plato claimed he was relaying a story that had been passed down through generations, originating from Egyptian priests who told visiting Greek thinkers about an earlier age. The details are a mixture of philosophical framing and older narrative elements. But the core idea, a society existing before known civilizations, destroyed by natural forces, resonates with flood myths from around the world. Archaeologists treat Atlantis as a story rather than evidence, and that approach is understandable. Plato used allegory frequently, and he was interested in moral lessons rather than historical documentation. But the story exists because it came from somewhere. Perhaps it was a memory of early settlements swallowed by the sea. Perhaps it was a distortion of events at the end of the Ice Age. Or perhaps it preserved a faint echo of a culture older than we currently recognize. Similar stories appear elsewhere: sunken kingdoms, lost lands, cities that disappeared beneath waves or into mountains. The names differ, but the themes overlap. Not every story refers to an ancient civilization. Many are purely symbolic, but some may contain fragments of memory passed down through lines of storytelling long after the physical evidence was erased. There are also myths describing knowledge that seems unusually advanced for the time in which the stories were recorded. Ancient calendars aligned with solstices and equinoxes. Cosmologies recognizing the precession of the stars. Narratives about long-distancing travel, mapping the sky, or calculating cycles that require careful observation. Archaeologists explain these through generations of careful watching and recording. And that explanation fits, but people often wonder whether some of this knowledge might have been inherited from earlier groups whose records did not survive. Another example is the widespread myth of a golden age. Civilizations across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas describe an early time when people lived in harmony, possessing skills later lost or diminished. These stories aren't literal accounts, but they share the idea that something existed before, something worth remembering. Perhaps not a golden age in the romantic sense, but a period when communities were stable, knowledgeable, or organized in ways that later generations perceived as ideal. When people hear these themes repeated, they don't necessarily believe the stories word for word. Instead, they sense that myths might hint at something archaeology hasn't yet uncovered, something early humans experienced, but didn't carve into stone or record with writing, something that lived in memory long after the physical traces disappeared. There's also the question of how myths preserve information. Oral tradition changes slowly when it's tied to ceremony, ritual, or cultural identity. Some stories are guarded carefully, passed down to specific members of a community. Others are retold often enough that they resist alteration. Over thousands of years, even symbolic stories can preserve structural truths. A flood myth might not describe a single event, but a pattern of rising water experienced repeatedly. A myth about ancestors building great structures might not refer to a lost city, but to early attempts at construction. But sometimes the myths feel too specific, too structured, or too technical to be entirely symbolic. For instance, certain Polynesian navigation stories describe ocean routes with stunning accuracy. They preserve star paths, wind patterns, and details about distant islands long before written maps existed. These traditions demonstrate how oral memory can function as a long-term information system. If navigation knowledge can survive centuries without written records, then memories of earlier societies could too. This becomes particularly interesting when you consider that myths often contain instructions. They tell people where to settle, where not to settle, when to plant, how to observe the sky, how to understand the cycles of nature. Some of these instructions appear ancient even within the cultures that hold them. They feel like remnants of something earlier, preserved because they remained useful. People often approach these stories with modern expectations, assuming that myth is either literal truth or fantasy. In reality, myth is a carrier of knowledge shaped by the needs of survival. If a group lived through a catastrophe, the story of that catastrophe would become a warning for future generations. The details would be dramatized to ensure the lesson wasn't forgotten. Over time, the original event might fade, but the structure of the lesson would endure. When multiple cultures tell stories about earlier ages, earlier builders, earlier teachers, and earlier disasters, it doesn't prove the existence of a forgotten civilization, but it suggests that human memory extends further back than our physical records. It suggests that the line between history and myth is thinner than we think. Even the most fantastical stories often contain realistic fragments. Some myths describe tools that resemble real technologies. Others mention migration that align with genetic studies. Still others mention land bridges, islands, or coastlines that geological science later confirmed. These examples show that myth can preserve information across extraordinary spans of time. The question people begin to ask once they notice these patterns isn't whether every myth refers to a lost civilization. It's whether some of them might contain hints of real events or real societies older than our current timeline allows. And if they do, then perhaps our understanding of early human history should include not only what the Earth preserves, but what the mind preserves as well. The Earth loses evidence quickly. The mind holds it differently. Stories can survive where structures collapse, where tools disintegrate, where landscapes sink beneath the sea. When people begin wondering whether something is missing from our early history, one of the first things they point to are the objects that don't seem to belong where they were found. These aren't the dramatic artifacts you sometimes see in fictional stories. Metal spheres from thousands of years before metalworking existed, machines buried in ancient rock layers, or relics that hint at impossible technologies. Most of those claims fall apart under examination. But there are more subtle discoveries that researchers debate quietly, not because they prove the existence of an ancient civilization, but because they challenge how tidy our timeline appears on the surface. These anomalies usually fall into a few categories: tools that seem too advanced for the time period, structures that appear earlier than expected, artifacts found in layers that don't match their usual chronology, and objects that suggest knowledge we assume humans didn't have yet. None of these items by themselves rewrite history, but when looked at collectively, they create little points of friction, places where the scientific explanation works logically, yet still leaves a small, lingering question. One of the earliest examples comes from advanced stone tools, found at sites that predate what we normally associate with complex craftsmanship. In certain regions of Africa and the Middle East, archaeologists have uncovered blade technologies that appear far earlier than the gradual developmental sequence would suggest. These blades are precise, shaped with an understanding of geometry, pressure, and fracture that even skilled modern knappers respect. Yet the layers they come from sometimes extend tens of thousands of years before we expect that level of sophistication. Archaeologists usually explain these findings by arguing that innovation doesn't move in a straight line. Skills appear, get lost, reappear, and evolve in ways that don't always match simple charts or diagrams. And that explanation makes sense. But for people looking closely at the timeline, the idea that early humans could create such refined tools and then abandon those methods for thousands of years raises a natural curiosity. Why would a technique vanish completely? Why would it not leave a clearer trail of development? Human innovation tends to spread, not shrink. But in these cases, it looks as though someone mastered a skill long before the surrounding cultural context supports it. Other anomalies involve cut marks on bones dating far earlier than expected. At several sites across Africa, Europe, and Asia, bones have been found bearing signs of butchery. Clean, intentional cuts likely made by tools dating back hundreds of thousands of years. Some of these marks appear in layers where the toolkit thought to exist at the time shouldn't have been capable of making such precise incisions. The common explanation is that the marks were made with sharp natural stones, or that the stratigraphy has been mixed. That can happen. Earthquakes, animal burrows, and water movement can shift objects in ways that confuse the layers. But not all cases are easy to dismiss. In some places, the geological context appears undisturbed, suggesting the marks really do belong where they were found. This doesn't prove anything extraordinary, but it hints that early humans might have had periods of experimentation or skill that did not leave clear archaeological trails. Another anomaly involves the seemingly sudden appearance of construction techniques we associate with later periods. One of the most striking examples is Göbekli, which predates agriculture but includes large stone pillars, carved reliefs, organized circles, and architectural planning. Archaeologists have studied this site extensively, and the prevailing view is that complex hunter-gatherer societies were more capable than previously imagined. That explanation is reasonable and supported by evidence. But for many people, the site raises another question. Why do we see such a large, coordinated structure appear before any clear signs of smaller, simpler structures that would form its developmental path? Normally, architectural traditions begin with basic shelters, then progress to more durable structures, then to monuments. But in some places, the sequence appears reversed. We find monumental building before we find the expected steps leading up to it. That reversal doesn't imply a lost civilization built these structures, but it suggests that our understanding of how early humans organized themselves might be incomplete. There are also objects that appear geographically out of place. Ancient beads made from marine shells found far inland, ochre pigments transported hundreds of kilometers. Materials traded across routes people didn't know existed in those periods. These anomalies show that early humans might have had longer travel networks than previously assumed. And when you expand the idea of long-distance movement, you open possibilities for knowledge transfer that the archaeological record hasn't fully captured. Some of the more unusual anomalies involve objects that appear far older than expected for their type. For example, in a few places, archaeologists have uncovered stones with drilled holes, perfectly round, smooth-sided holes that suggest controlled drilling techniques. These objects are rare, and explanations vary widely. Some researchers argue that natural processes can create similar shapes. Others believe ancient people used simple bow drills earlier than expected, and that could well be true. But these objects don't show the gradual refinement we expect. They appear as complete techniques, then disappear, then reappear millennia later in a different form. This discontinuity raises quiet questions about how knowledge was created, spread, or forgotten. Another type of anomaly comes from the alignment of certain structures with astronomical events. People often focus on the famous examples: stone circles aligned with solstices, ancient temples aligned with star positions. But the surprising part isn't the existence of such alignments, it's their precision. At some sites, the alignments are so exact that they require careful observation over long periods, including knowledge of celestial cycles that most textbooks say early humans wouldn't have tracked so precisely. Archaeologists often interpret these alignments as the result of long-term observation by dedicated individuals within a culture, and that explanation is valid. But again, the question lingers: how did such precise knowledge emerge so early? How were these observations maintained, communicated, and used? If societies had the ability to track the sky with that level of accuracy, it suggests a stability and organization that might not be visible elsewhere in the archaeological record. Some anomalies come from the craftsmanship of early structures. Large stones fitted so precisely that not even a blade can pass between them. Blocks weighing many tons moved long distances without evidence of the tools used to transport or shape them. Archaeologists explain these feats through ingenuity, teamwork, and knowledge of leverage. And certainly, humans have always been ingenious. But people looking at these structures often wonder why similar levels of craftsmanship appear in certain places and times, but not in others. If a technique exists, why doesn't it appear more broadly? If a method of moving large stones was known, why did it disappear in later periods? These discontinuities don't prove anything dramatic, but they make the timeline feel less smooth than the simplified version we often learn. There are also anomalies involving artistic ability. Cave paintings tens of thousands of years old show proportion, shading, and motion in ways that resemble techniques associated with modern art training. These paintings are stunning, detailed, and expressive. Archaeologists see them as evidence of cognitive sophistication early in human history, and that interpretation is accurate. But some people look at the paintings and see something else, a level of skill that doesn't align naturally with the idea of humans gradually developing artistic ability. Instead, it suggests that early humans were already capable of complex representation. And if they were capable of that, what else might they have been capable of that didn't survive? Another category involves objects that seem too advanced. Metal artifacts found in layers older than established metallurgy, tools made from materials not supposed to exist in that region, small figurines or carvings that resemble styles from distant cultures. Most of these anomalies end up explained through contamination, misinterpretation, or error in dating. But not all cases are resolved neatly. A few remain debated, not widely accepted, but not fully dismissed either. They linger at the edges of archaeology like unsolved puzzles, interesting enough to question, not reliable enough to rewrite the books. There are also oddities involving early maps. Some ancient maps appear to show coastlines that would only have been visible thousands of years ago, before sea levels rose. These maps are rare and controversial. Many scholars argue that they reflect imaginative speculation or misinterpretation by later seatographers. Others suggest they might be based on older sources that no longer exist. The debate isn't about proving a lost civilization. It's about whether knowledge can survive far longer than its physical records. Another intriguing category involves evidence of early construction at sites currently beneath layers of later history. For example, deep beneath certain cities, researchers have foundations that appear older than the structures built on top of them. In many cases, these early layers are interpreted as simple dwellings or fortifications, but occasionally they include features that suggest planning, engineering, or craftsmanship not expected in that time period. These layers are hard to study because they are deep beneath active settlements. Excavating them fully would require dismantling modern cities. So researchers work with limited access, creating partial pictures that leave many questions unanswered. It's important to understand that most archaeologists are aware of these anomalies. They study them, discuss them, and debate them. But they also know how fragile early evidence is. A single object out of context cannot rewrite a timeline. A single structure cannot redefine a civilization. The scientific method demands consistency, repetition, and a pattern that cannot be dismissed as coincidence. So, anomalies remain anomalies until broader evidence appears. Some eventually get explained. Others remain open questions. For people outside the field, these open questions are exactly what spark curiosity. When you read about an object that doesn't fit the expected timeline, or a structure that appears too early, or a tool that looks too advanced, it creates a sense that the story we have is incomplete. Not wrong, but missing something earlier, something that might not have survived well enough to be recognized. And this feeling becomes stronger when you look at how scattered these anomalies are. They don't point to a single lost civilization. They point to possibilities, moments where early humans might have been more capable than we assume, times when knowledge emerged, spread, faded, and reappeared. These fluctuations don't prove a hidden ancient society, but they leave space for the idea that the earliest chapters of our story might be more complicated than the smooth timeline in textbooks. When people look at archaeology from the outside, it can seem like a field built on steady agreement. There's a timeline, a collection of dates, a sequence of developments, and a set of methods designed to uncover the past. But once you look closely, you realize that archaeology is filled with disagreements, sometimes quiet, sometimes tense, occasionally intense enough to spill out of academic journals and into the public. These disagreements aren't signs of dishonesty or suppression. They're signs of a field trying to understand a past that reveals itself in fragments. Scientists disagree for many reasons, and almost all of them come from the nature of the evidence itself. Archaeology deals with objects that are incomplete, worn, displaced, soot-coated, water-damaged, scattered by storms, buried by landslides, or altered by animal activity. Very few discoveries come with clear instructions. Instead, each artifact is a clue with multiple interpretations. And researchers, being human, interpret those clues differently. When an object is ambiguous, two scientists can look at it and see two different stories. One sees innovation, another sees coincidence. One sees human intention, another sees natural formation. Both interpretations might be reasonable, and neither might be provable with the available evidence. So debates begin not because anyone is trying to hide something, but because the truth is harder to pin down than people imagine. These disagreements become sharper when the evidence touches on periods that are already thinly understood. The earlier the site, the less material survives, and the more interpretation is required. This creates fertile ground for conflict. One researcher argues that a stone was shaped by human hands. Another argues that it fractured naturally. One sees signs of controlled fire. Another sees signs of lightning strike or tree root burn. One sees a structure. Another sees geological layering. Each perspective has its own logic, its own internal consistency. And because early evidence is fragile, small differences in interpretation can lead to entirely different conclusions about the past. Archaeology is also shaped by the tools researchers use. Dating methods come with ranges of error. Radioarbon samples can be contaminated. Soil layers can shift. The deeper you go into time, the more uncertain the dating becomes. This uncertainty doesn't mean the methods are invalid. It simply means they require careful handling. And when two researchers apply slightly different assumptions to the same set of numbers, they might place the same artifact thousands of years apart. These scientific uncertainties overlap with something else: professional investment. Researchers spend years, sometimes decades, studying particular regions, time periods, or cultural traditions. Their careers grow around the timelines they help build. When new evidence challenges those timelines, it can feel destabilizing. Not because they want to hide anything, but because accepting a major revision means rethinking foundational assumptions. This is difficult in any field. In archaeology, where evidence accumulates slowly and painstakingly, it can feel especially disruptive. This is where disagreements become fierce, not out of malice, but out of the sheer weight of what's at stake. If a new discovery pushes the chronology of human settlement back by thousands of years, entire models of migration, adaptation, and development need to be reworked. If a tool appears older than expected, it implies that earlier humans were capable of things previously dismissed. If a structure predates agriculture, then assumptions about the relationship between farming and social organization need to shift. These shifts do happen. Archaeology changes constantly. New discoveries rewrite parts of the timeline regularly. But because these changes must withstand scrutiny, they move slowly. And as they move, debates unfold. Some researchers are cautious, waiting for more evidence. Others are bold, proposing sweeping reinterpretations. The tension between caution and boldness produces disagreement, sometimes narrow, sometimes loud enough to reach public attention. One of the most intense areas of debate involves the earliest arrival of humans in various regions. For decades, scientists believe that humans entered the Americas around 13,000 years ago. This idea was based on a handful of sites with distinctive tools, but then evidence emerged suggesting humans may have been present much earlier. Some artifacts, footprints, and sedimentary signals hinted at dates tens of thousands of years older. Not all researchers accepted those findings. Some argued that the tools weren't tools, that the footprints weren't human, that the dating was flawed. Others insisted the evidence was strong enough to overturn the older model. This debate lasted decades. Eventually, the earlier dates gained widespread acceptance, but only after rigorous analysis and repeated confirmation. This pattern repeats across archaeology. New claims are met with skepticism, not because anyone wants to dismiss them, but because extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence. When you work with ancient materials, mistakes are easy to make. Soil moves, artifacts shift, natural processes mimic human ones. Caution becomes a shield against accidentally rewriting history based on an error. But that caution can be interpreted as stubbornness by those who see promise in the new findings. Another source of disagreement involves how researchers interpret context. An artifact alone tells a limited story. The soil around it, the sediments, the nearby objects, the depth, the chemical signatures, all these details determine its place in the timeline. When context is unclear or disrupted, interpretation becomes subjective. One archaeologist might see the context as intact. Another might see signs of disturbance. The same artifact viewed through two different interpretations of its surroundings becomes two different pieces of history. This leads to debates that sound almost philosophical. How do you determine if a layer is undisturbed? How do you confirm whether an object was moved by natural forces? How do you distinguish between human placement and geological accident? These questions don't have simple answers, and the disagreements often turn into discussions about methodology. Another factor shaping debate is the diversity of disciplines involved. Archaeology draws from geology, biology, chemistry, anthropology, climatology, and history. Each discipline has its own methods, assumptions, and perspectives. A geologist may interpret a layer one way. A biologist might interpret the organic material differently. A chemist might question the dating results. A cultural anthropologist might emphasize oral traditions. These cross-disciplinary disagreements can become heated because each field values different kinds of evidence. A discovery might appeal strongly to one discipline, but appear unconvincing to another. When the evidence is especially controversial, such as claims of extremely early human activity or hints of sophisticated behavior far before the established timeline, the disagreements intensify. Some researchers see these findings as opportunities to expand understanding. Others view them as threats to rigor. This friction doesn't mean anyone is hiding information. It means the field is cautious about rewriting history prematurely. Funding also plays a role. Archaeological projects require significant resources: grants, permits, equipment, and labor. These resources are limited, and researchers compete for them. A bold, controversial project might attract attention and funding, or it might be viewed as risky and unworthy of investment. This dynamic can fuel disagreements. Some researchers push for exploration of unconventional ideas, believing they might lead to breakthroughs. Others argue that scarce resources should be spent on safer, more established lines of inquiry. None of this is corruption or conspiracy. It's the reality of working in a field where money, time, and access are limited. Researchers must make decisions about what to prioritize, and those decisions reflect different philosophies and perspectives. Personality also influences debate. Archaeology often attracts people with strong opinions, deep attachments to particular interpretations, or emotional connections to specific regions or cultures. When these individuals disagree, the debates can become personal, even when both sides are acting in good faith. These personal tensions sometimes spill into public discussions, creating the impression of hostility or secrecy, when in reality, it's simply the natural friction of passionate people working with difficult evidence. Another reason disagreements become intense is the emotional impact of rewriting familiar stories. People value history. They see it as part of identity, cultural heritage, or national pride. When new research challenges beloved stories, it can be met with resistance. Some researchers worry about how communities will react. Others worry about misinterpretations spreading in the public. These concerns add another layer to the debates, shaping how openly certain ideas are discussed. The debate becomes especially fierce when it touches on the idea of a first civilization. Most archaeologists do not support the idea of a lost, advanced society predating known ones. Not because they reject the possibility outright, but because there is no solid, consistent evidence for it. When someone presents an anomalous artifact, archaeologists want context. When someone points to a structure underwater, archaeologists want stratigraphy. When someone references a myth, archaeologists want correlation with material culture. These demands are not attempts to dismiss the idea. They're attempts to evaluate it scientifically. But to people outside the field, these demands sometimes feel like barriers. Some interpret the caution as suppression. Others interpret disagreement as coordinated denial. In most cases, the reality is much more ordinary. Scientists disagree because the evidence is unclear, and they want to avoid drawing conclusions too early. Despite the heated debates, archaeology does accept new ideas when the evidence becomes strong enough. The timeline of human migration has been revised repeatedly. The origin of agriculture has been reinterpreted many times. The understanding of early human behavior has expanded enormously. These changes did not happen because researchers agreed easily. They happened because persistent evidence eventually overcame disagreement. This is a slow process, but it's also a reliable one. It ensures that changes to the timeline are grounded in evidence, not speculation. Still, the debates leave room for imagination. When researchers argue about anomalous tools, strange sites, and unusual artifacts, it signals that the story is not complete. It signals that the early timeline has flexibility. It signals that there may be discoveries ahead that shift the consensus again. And this is where the conversation becomes especially interesting. When the disagreements are strongest, when interpretations pull in different directions, when evidence sits on the edge of certainty, these are the places where new understanding often begins. The dust of debate may seem chaotic, but it's where the field grows. One of the strangest things about archaeology is that much of what we seek is not really hidden. It isn't locked in vaults or guarded behind locked doors. It isn't kept in secret labs or filed away in restricted archives. More often, the evidence people imagine being suppressed sits in open view, scattered across landscapes, resting in museum storage rooms, or buried in research papers that only a handful of specialists ever read. Evidence becomes lost not through deliberate concealment, but through the quiet, ordinary ways information slips between the cracks of attention, interpretation, funding, and understanding. This usually becomes clear once you realize just how much material archaeologists collect during an excavation. Even a modest dig produces tens of thousands of fragments: pottery shards, flakes of stone, animal bones, soil samples, carbon fragments, plant remains, and small objects so worn that their original purpose can only be guessed. Every piece must be cataloged, labeled, analyzed, stored, and often reanalyzed as new technologies emerge. The scale is overwhelming. Most museums and research institutions have warehouses full of artifacts the public will never see. Not because someone wants to hide them, but because there are simply too many to display. The majority remain in boxes stacked on metal shelves, waiting for someone to study them, someone who may never come. This is one way evidence gets lost. It becomes invisible through abundance. When you have 100,000 fragments from a single site, it's easy for a crucial detail to sit unnoticed for years. An unusual tool might be cataloged incorrectly. A bone with cut marks might be labeled as natural breakage. A tiny bead might be boxed with unrelated materials. These mistakes aren't sinister, they're the result of human limits. There are more artifacts than there are researchers to study them. Another way evidence gets lost involves how discoveries are published. Scientific papers often focus on specific questions. A researcher might spend years studying the chemical composition of ancient pigments or the tool marks on a set of bones. The resulting paper includes details about those materials, leaving out anything not directly relevant. Over time, papers accumulate in academic journals, dense, technical, precise, and accessible mostly to other researchers. Within these papers, small observations occasionally appear that don't fit neatly into the established timeline. A dating anomaly, a tool made using an unexpected technique, a structure that seems more complex than surrounding layers suggest. These details are recorded, but they remain isolated, disconnected from bigger narratives because no single researcher has the time or mandate to weave them together. When people imagine evidence of a first civilization being hidden, they picture someone locking it away, but in reality, the opposite happens. Researchers publish almost everything, often to meet requirements for funding or academic advancement. The information is there. It just doesn't gather into a larger picture unless someone decides to connect the dots. And connecting dots across decades of scattered papers is difficult work that few people dedicate their careers to. Evidence can also be misunderstood because early interpretations gain momentum. Once a theory becomes widely accepted, new discoveries tend to be interpreted through that lens. For example, if a site is assumed to belong to a certain time period, findings that don't fit might be attributed to disturbance or contamination. This is not suppression. It's an attempt to avoid jumping to conclusions based on limited data. But sometimes the cautious interpretation becomes the default interpretation, even when the unusual evidence deserves a closer look. Over time, the accepted narrative solidifies, and anything that doesn't match it becomes harder to integrate, not because anyone forbids it, but because doing so requires rethinking things that once seemed settled. Another way evidence becomes hidden is through the complexity of nature. The Earth is constantly moving, shifting, eroding, burying, and revealing. Rivers change course. Floods rearrange sediments. Landslides cover entire slopes. Animals dig burrows. Tree roots push objects deeper underground. Over thousands of years, These processes can mix layers in ways that make human activity look natural, or natural formations look artificial. For example, a stone that seems intentionally shaped might actually be a product of freeze-thaw cycles. A grouping of rocks that looks like a foundation might be the result of erosion. A carved surface might be created by water. At the same time, genuinely intentional structures can be dismissed as natural because they have become too weathered to look clearly artificial. This creates a type of passive misinterpretation where real evidence sits in view but is dismissed for understandable reasons. Sometimes this misinterpretation goes in the opposite direction. Researchers find something visually unusual, an arrangement of stones, a pattern on the ground, and assume it's natural because they're trained to avoid over-identifying human activity. Archaeology relies heavily on caution, and that caution can sometimes obscure discoveries, not deliberately, but through the understandable fear of claiming something artificial incorrectly. Then there are the discoveries made by non-specialists. Hikers, divers, construction workers, and curious explorers sometimes stumble upon unusual sites. Walls beneath the sea, geometric patterns in the forest, carved stones far from known settlements. Some of these discoveries are investigated. Others are noted briefly, documented superficially, and set aside because the evidence is thin or difficult to access. Many sites that spark excitement among the public receive only minimal attention from researchers because they lack funding, context, or feasibility. The site might be too dangerous to excavate. It might be politically sensitive. It might be beneath private property. It might require more resources than any single team has available. These practical limitations are rarely discussed publicly, but they shape what is studied and what is left untouched. Evidence also becomes misunderstood when technological limits prevent accurate analysis. 100 years ago, archaeologists lacked modern dating techniques. 50 years ago, underwater mapping was primitive. 20 years ago, lyre was barely used in jungle environments. As technology advances, earlier interpretations need to be revisited. But revisiting old digs requires time and money, and many sites sit untouched for decades. Layers that once yielded nothing interesting might now hold clues recognizable with modern tools. But unless someone returns to the site, the evidence remains silent. There are countless examples of forgotten evidence rediscovered later. Objects stored in museum basement for generations suddenly become significant when new analytic techniques reveal things previous researchers couldn't detect. Bits of pigment turn out to contain unexpected minerals. Bones reveal genetic secrets. Stone tools show microscopic usewear patterns invisible without modern imaging. At the time they were first cataloged, these objects looked ordinary. Only later do they become extraordinary. Sometimes evidence gets lost through the destruction of sites. Development, agriculture, mining, and construction erase archaeological layers before anyone can study them. The foundations of ancient settlements can be bulldozed, paved over, or buried beneath modern cities. In some regions, ancient sites lie beneath layers of concrete, asphalt, and steel. Archaeologists know they exist, but excavation is impossible without dismantling the living world above. These sites become frozen in place, undisturbed but unreachable. Whatever secrets they hold remain locked beneath structures that cannot be removed. In other cases, politics and borders complicate exploration. Some regions are too unstable for research. Others are off limits due to national policy, land rights, or conflict. Archaeologically rich landscapes can sit untouched for generations, not because someone wants to hide them, but because safety, diplomacy, or legal restrictions make exploration impossible. Evidence can lie just beneath the surface, literally visible in satellite imagery, yet remain unstudied because no one can physically reach it. One of the most surprising ways evidence is lost is through misclassification. Archaeologists often divide finds into categories: natural, human, recent, ancient. Once a piece is categorized, it tends to stay in that category unless someone questions the classification. But classification is done by humans who can make mistakes. A tool mistaken for a naturally broken stone can end up in a box marked geological. A modified bone might be labeled as animal activity. A piece of pottery with unusual markings might be interpreted as decorative rather than functional or symbolic. These small misclassifications accumulate quietly, and unless a researcher deliberately reviews old collections, many objects remain misunderstood for decades. Things also get lost simply because research trends shift. Scientists focus on topics that are currently funded or fashionable. Areas of inquiry that were once deeply studied sometimes fall out of academic favor. When that happens, associated evidence becomes neglected. Researchers stop revisiting certain sites. They stop analyzing certain artifacts. Over time, the supporting knowledge fades, and the data becomes harder to interpret. The site hasn't changed. The tools haven't changed. The bones haven't changed. But the context, the intellectual framework needed to understand them, has shifted. This shift can make evidence appear trivial or irrelevant, even when it might contribute to a larger overlooked pattern. Some evidence becomes lost in the simplest way possible. It doesn't look like evidence. Early humans made tools from wood, fiber, and other organic materials that rarely survive. They built dwellings from earth, leaves, woven branches, and skins. They left temporary structures that vanished without a trace. Many early societies might have used techniques that leave almost no archaeological footprint. If objects aren't made from stone or metal, they disappear. And without durable materials, even large communities could pass through history silently. This makes it easy to misunderstand how much evidence we are missing. When people imagine an early civilization, they picture stone. But most human innovation initially used softer materials. Evidence of weaving, building, engineering, and cultural development may have existed in abundance, only to rot away long before the modern geological layers formed. Sometimes misunderstood evidence comes from places we wouldn't expect. Caves, deserts, mountains, and underwater plains can preserve objects in unusual ways. But when these preserved pieces first appear, they can look strange, out of place, or incomplete. If a scientist encounters something that looks anomalous, but only has a fragment, the cautious approach is to avoid speculation. This caution is important scientifically, but it can cause the anomaly to fade from attention even when it deserves more study. When you put all these factors together, misclassification, overwhelming volume, buried sites, technological limits, natural disturbances, political barriers, interpretive caution, and the fragility of ancient materials, it becomes easier to see why evidence might sit unnoticed or misunderstood. Not because anyone is hiding it, but because the process of discovery is unpredictable, incomplete, and shaped by human limitations. Most of the evidence that challenges the accepted timeline exists in ambiguous states, too incomplete to confirm, too unusual to ignore, too scattered to form a pattern. These anomalies accumulate in the background, waiting for new discoveries, new techniques, or new perspectives that might connect them. When you look closely at how archaeology works, you begin to understand that the problems facing the field aren't only scientific, they're also human. The evidence sits in the ground, patient and unchanging. The tools, the methods, the measurements, they all move forward slowly and steadily. But the people doing the work bring their own emotions, ambitions, fears, expectations, and habits. These human elements are not flaws. They are simply part of what it means to interpret the past. Yet they shape the field in ways most people never see. And sometimes they create barriers that feel larger than any debated artifact or controversial discovery. One of the most influential human forces in archaeology is ego. Not the dramatic, selfish ego we imagine in stories, but a quieter, more natural form. The desire to be right, the desire to protect years of work, the desire to maintain professional reputation. Researchers spend large parts of their lives studying very narrow topics. They dedicate entire careers to understanding one region, one period, one culture, one type of tool, or one kind of material. Their identity becomes intertwined with their expertise. When a new discovery threatens to alter the timeline they've built, it can feel like a challenge to their life's work. This doesn't mean researchers deliberately ignore new evidence. Most are dedicated to the truth above all else. But ego shows up in more subtle ways. A researcher might unconsciously favor interpretations that align with their previous findings, or they might be slower to accept changes that force them to revise their long-held views. These tendencies happen in every scientific field. They're not malicious, they're human. But in archaeology, where evidence is often ambiguous and open to interpretation, ego can influence the direction of debate. For example, when a younger researcher proposes an unexpected interpretation, old experts might push back more forcefully, not because the idea is wrong, but because it challenges a framework that has existed for decades. When a controversial site appears on the edge of what's considered possible, established researchers might resist giving it legitimacy until the evidence becomes overwhelming. This resistance isn't a coordinated effort. It's a natural reluctance to accept that a carefully built picture might be incomplete. Another human factor influencing archaeology is funding. Archaeology isn't a field where projects can be done casually. Excavation is expensive. Fieldwork requires permits, equipment, specialists, transportation, lodging, and careful documentation. Post-excavation analysis requires laboratories, imaging technology, storage facilities, and trained researchers. All of this costs money, and money flows toward the ideas donors, institutions, or governments consider valuable or credible. Or when a project aligns with widely accepted research goals, migration patterns, agricultural origins, ancient trade routes, it's easier to secure funding. When a project challenges established models, pushes the boundaries of what's considered likely, or lacks strong initial evidence, funding becomes harder to obtain. This doesn't mean unconventional ideas are suppressed, but it does mean they often sit on the edge of feasibility. A site that hints at something extraordinary might receive less attention simply because no one can afford to study it. Funding pressures also create another subtle dynamic. Researchers need to publish consistently to maintain their positions. They need to produce results that justify the grants they receive. This system encourages safe, steady work rather than risky, groundbreaking projects. If a researcher spends years studying a site that turns out to be inconclusive, their career can suffer. So, they choose projects that promise clearer results. This creates a quiet form of selection bias. Evidence that might disrupt the timeline is riskier to pursue. Evidence that fits neatly into established models is safer. Over decades, this shapes the direction of research, not through censorship, but through the practical realities of maintaining careers and securing resources. Then there's the issue of academic reputation. Archaeology is a small field. Researchers know one another, review one another's papers, collaborate on projects, and compete for grants. When someone presents a bold claim, they risk criticism not just from strangers, but from colleagues they've known for decades. This creates a natural caution. No one wants to be the person associated with a claim that later proves incorrect. So, even when evidence appears intriguing, researchers often wait for others to take the first steps toward interpretation. This caution grows stronger in areas where sensational claims are common. For instance, underwater structures, anomalous artifacts, and ancient myths often attract attention from outside the academic community. Some researchers fear that engaging with these topics could damage their reputation by associating them with fringe interpretations. This fear doesn't come from arrogance. It comes from the pressure to maintain credibility in a profession where credibility is everything. As a result, Certain areas of inquiry remain understudied, not because the evidence is unimportant, but because the professional risks outweigh the potential rewards. Another human challenge is the fear of being wrong. Archaeology moves slowly, and the consequences of error can linger for decades. A misinterpretation recorded in a major publication can influence generations of researchers. A flawed timeline can shape multiple disciplines, requiring enormous effort to correct. This fear creates a strong incentive to be conservative in interpretation. Researchers prefer to acknowledge uncertainty rather than make claims that might later be overturned. But this caution can sometimes prevent new ideas from receiving serious consideration. Even when evidence appears compelling, researchers may hesitate to draw conclusions until multiple independent teams confirm the findings. This is scientifically sound, but it also means that groundbreaking discoveries often take much longer to become accepted. In the meantime, ideas that fall outside the mainstream remain on the periphery, gathering interest from the public, but receiving little formal attention. In addition to ego and fear, there is the influence of academic culture. Each generation of researchers inherits the assumptions of the generation before. These assumptions become part of the intellectual landscape. New archaeologists learn what questions are acceptable, what methods are reliable, what interpretations are considered valid. They learn which controversies are worth exploring and which ones are avoided. These cultural expectations shape what young researchers study, what they publish, and what they consider possible. For instance, if a generation of archaeologists believes that complex societies cannot exist before agriculture, new researchers trained in that environment are less likely to consider evidence that contradicts that belief. They aren't suppressing anything, they simply internalize the framework they were taught. Changing that framework requires gradual shifts in education, publications, and discoveries. Another human influence in archaeology involves communication with the public. Researchers often feel pressure to present simple narratives that non-spatialists can understand. Complex or uncertain findings are difficult to translate into clear stories. As a result, simplified versions of history become widely accepted. Students learn neat timelines. Museums create tidy displays. Documentaries present coherent developments. These simplified narratives are useful for teaching, but they hide the messy, ambiguous reality. When new evidence contradicts the simplified version, it appears shocking, not because the science was hiding anything, but because the public never saw the complexity in the first place. This creates a strange gap between professional archaeology and public understanding. Researchers know the timeline is full of uncertainty. They know early evidence is scattered and incomplete. They know many discoveries remain ambiguous, but the public sees a timeline that looks precise and complete. When anomalies appear, people imagine they're being hidden because they conflict with the tidy story they learned. In reality, the tidy story was never the full story. It was a teaching tool. Another human element shaping archaeology is personal bias. Researchers are influenced by their backgrounds, experiences, cultural identities, and educational paths. These elements shape what they find interesting, what they question, and what they accept. A researcher trained in geology might see natural processes, where another sees human impact. A researcher focused on symbolic anthropology might emphasize myth and ritual, where another sees practical adaptation. Neither viewpoint is wrong, but each produces different interpretations of the same evidence. This diversity can be a strength, leading to richer discussions and more nuanced conclusions. But it can also create conflict as researchers argue not only over evidence, but over the frameworks used to interpret it. The result is a field where disagreements are constant, but progress emerges through the friction. The human problem grows even more complicated when you consider national identity. Many nations take pride in their ancient histories. When controversial discoveries appear, they can challenge narratives that people consider foundational. Governments may restrict excavation or publication not to hide the truth, but to protect cultural memory, tourism, or political stability. Local communities may resist excavation of sacred sites or burial grounds. These decisions create gaps in the archaeological record that have nothing to do with suppression and everything to do with cultural respect or political necessity. And finally, there is the emotional impact of the unknown. Archaeologists, like everyone else, want to believe the world makes sense. They want to believe that the timeline is coherent, that the development of civilization follows understandable patterns, that human progress unfolds in ways that can be documented and explained. When evidence appears that threatens this sense of order, it creates discomfort, not fear of discovery, but fear of instability, a fear that the years spent building a model of human history might need serious revision. This emotional response doesn't lead to suppression, but it does lead to caution. It leads to slow acceptance. It leads to a preference for explanations that preserve coherence over explanations that introduce chaos. None of these human influences invalidate archaeology, they simply shape it. They explain why some ideas are embraced quickly, while others take time to gain acceptance. They explain why evidence can sit unnoticed for years, not because it is being hidden, but because no one has the incentive, resources, or confidence to pursue it. When you listen to archaeologists talk about proof, you begin to realize that the word means something very different inside the field than it does outside of it. Most people think of proof as a clear demonstration, something obvious, something undeniable, a fingerprint left on history, a structure, a tool, a text, a moment frozen in time. But archaeology deals with deep time. It works in layers where certainty erodes, long before anyone arrives to examine it. The kind of proof people imagine, solid, unshakable, definitive, rarely survives long enough to be discovered. Instead, researchers rely on patterns, probabilities, consistencies, and context. Proof becomes something built over time, not a single object, but a network of clues joining together to form a conclusion strong enough to withstand doubt. This kind of proof can feel fragile to those outside the discipline. It's easier to imagine a lost civilization leaving behind a monumental structure than it is to imagine it leaving behind a scatter of subtle indicators that require decades of analysis to interpret. But the more researchers study ancient history, the more they understand that what survives is rarely what people think would survive. Stone crumbles, metal corrodes, organic materials vanish, buildings collapse into dust and blend into the landscape. Whole cities can erode until they resemble natural hills. In the end, small things endure more reliably than large ones. Seeds, flakes of stone, microscopic residues from fires long extinguished. The challenge is that small evidence leads to big uncertainty. A seed can tell you what people ate, but not who they were. A shattered tool can tell you how they shaped materials, but not what they dreamed of, built, or believed. And when researchers attempt to assemble meaning from these fragments, disagreements arise. These disagreements make proof feel elusive, even when the evidence is right in front of them. Because of this, archaeologists have developed strict standards for what constitutes proof. An object must be found in a clear context. The soil around it must support its age. The materials must match regional expectations. The surrounding sediments must confirm that the layer hasn't been disturbed. If any of these elements appear questionable, the claim weakens. Researchers know how easy it is for the earth to move things. They know how tree roots, animal burrows, or flooding can carry objects into places where they don't belong. They know how contamination can distort dates. So they treat certainty as something earned, not granted. This caution is essential, but it also means that extraordinary claims face nearly insurmountable hurdles. If someone found an object that suggested complex technology existed far earlier than expected, the first question archaeologists would ask is whether the object was displaced. If someone uncovered a structure that seemed too advanced for the accepted timeline, The first step would be verifying the stratigraphy. If someone pointed to a cluster of unusual artifacts, researchers would want to know if there were enough of them to indicate a pattern. Without multiple lines of evidence, a single object, no matter how strange, cannot rewrite history. For the public, this can feel frustrating. People want discoveries to speak clearly. They want the Earth to tell its story without hesitation. They want a single artifact to reveal everything. But the Earth doesn't work like that. It holds its secrets unevenly. It preserves some periods lavishly and others sparsely. It buries, distorts, scatters, and reclaims. Proof in archaeology becomes a negotiation between what survives and what can be confidently interpreted. This helps explain why the idea of a first civilization, something older than anything currently recognized, faces such a high barrier. For researchers to accept such a claim, they would need evidence so strong, so consistent, so clearly contextualized that it withstands every alternative explanation. And the further back in time the claim reaches, the harder it becomes to gather evidence that meets these standards. Deep time erases proof faster than archaeologists can uncover it. There have been instances when new discoveries shifted the timeline dramatically. The realization that humans reached the Americas earlier than expected is one example. The discovery of sophisticated building at sites believed to predate agriculture is another. In each of these cases, the change required multiple independent discoveries. Not just one site, not just one artifact, but a pattern emerging across landscapes and regions, a cluster of evidence that grew too large to dismiss. This is how proof works in a field built on fragments. It accumulates. It repeats. It appears from different angles. And only when these pieces reinforce one another do researchers accept a revised timeline. A civilization older than any we currently acknowledge would require similar reinforcement. It wouldn't be enough to find a single advanced structure underwater. It wouldn't be enough to uncover a handful of unusual tools in an ancient layer. It wouldn't be enough to point to myths or oral traditions. The evidence would need to appear again and again across continents, across contexts, with clarity strong enough to erase doubt. The difficulty is that older evidence rarely appears in abundance. The further you go into the past, the fewer artifacts remain. Entire eras may leave behind nothing but stone flakes or charcoal fragments. If complex societies existed before our earliest recognized civilizations, most of what they created might be gone. Their buildings may have crumbled, their tools eroded, their settlements drowned by rising seas or covered by shifting sediments. What remains might be faint, barely distinguishable from natural formations. Proof in such a world becomes less like a monument and more like a whisper. And yet, archaeologists know the world is filled with whispers. They know that many discoveries begin with something small, an unusual layer, a curious alignment, a pattern that seems slightly off. These hints sometimes grow into bigger insights, but just as often they remain unresolved. Proof in the archaeological sense requires more than curiosity. It requires the ability to rule out alternative explanations. A site must be unmistakably artificial. A layer must be clearly undisturbed. A tool must be undeniably shaped by human hands. These standards protect the field from error, but they also create a narrow window for recognizing evidence that doesn't fit known models. This tension, the need for high standards and the fragility of ancient clues, leads to a strange situation. It's possible for evidence of a very early civilization to exist, but not meet the criteria necessary to be recognized as such. Researchers might catalog it as natural. They might classify it as anomalous but insignificant. They might set it aside because it lacks context. In this sense, evidence can be lost in plain sight, not because anyone ignores it deliberately, but because it cannot speak loudly enough to overcome doubt. It's also important to understand how interdisciplinary confirmation works. When researchers find something extraordinary, They need support from multiple lines of inquiry. A structure must be confirmed not only by archaeologists, but by geologists who verify the layers. A tool must be analyzed by experts in fracture mechanics. A date must be confirmed by different methods: radiocarbon, luminescence, stratigraphy. If any one of these elements conflicts with the rest, the claim weakens. This process ensures that conclusions are robust. But it also means that ambiguous evidence will struggle to gain acceptance, even if the ambiguity results from time's erosion rather than scientific weakness. Another challenge is communication. Scientists are careful with their language. They talk about possibilities, not certainties. They describe evidence as suggestive, compatible, or inconclusive. For the public, this language can sound evasive. People want clear statements, yes or no, true or false. But archaeology rarely allows such clarity. The deeper into time researchers go, the more they face uncertainty. Proof becomes layered. It becomes conditional. It becomes something that grows stronger or weaker as new evidence appears. Public expectations also shape how proof is understood. People often assume that discoveries are immediate, dramatic, and unmistakable. But real archaeology is slow. Sometimes it takes decades to understand the significance of a single site. A stone circle might be excavated today, reinterpreted in 50 years, and fully understood a century later. This timeline doesn't match the pace of public curiosity. As a result, ideas that lack immediate clarity often drift into speculative territory, where they mix with imagination and myth. This is one reason why controversial discoveries become so emotionally charged. When evidence appears that challenges established models, people outside the field sometimes embrace it faster than researchers do. They see possibility where archaeologists see uncertainty. They see potential proof where scientists see incomplete context. This mismatch of expectation creates tension. The public imagines suppression. The researchers imagine over-interpretation. Both sides want to understand the truth, but they approach it from different angles. Even within archaeology, proof is not a single threshold but a spectrum. Some evidence is strong enough to be widely accepted. Some is promising but needs more support. Some is intriguing but inconclusive, and some is simply too ambiguous to interpret. Researchers move carefully along the spectrum, placing discoveries where they best fit. The public often sees only the end points, accepted facts and rejected claims, without noticing the large middle area filled with unresolved questions. This gray zone is where most of archaeology actually lives. Proof grows there gradually through repeated discoveries and refined analyses. And this process explains why the idea of a first civilization remains speculative. The evidence people point to, submerged structures, anomalous artifacts, myths, unusual tools, often falls into this middle area, interesting enough to inspire debate, ambiguous enough to avoid consensus, not strong enough to rewrite the timeline, not weak enough to dismiss entirely. For a lost civilization to enter the accepted narrative, the evidence would need to move decisively out of this gray zone. It would need to become consistent, contextualized, and corroborated across regions. It would need to survive not only erosion and time, but the rigorous scrutiny of multiple disciplines. This isn't because archaeologists want to protect an existing timeline. It's because they want the revised timeline to rest on solid ground. In a world where the past is faint, proof must be durable. It must withstand doubt. It must bridge the gap between fragment and conclusion. Archaeologists aren't waiting for a single artifact to overturn the story. They're waiting for a pattern that cannot be explained any other way. And this brings us closer to the heart of the question. If a first civilization did exist, one older than any we currently recognize, what would its proof look like today? What would remain? What would survive beneath the waves, beneath the soil, beneath layers of time so deep that memory itself fades? When you follow the scattered pieces of this story all the way to the edges, through the gaps in the timeline, The flooded coastlines, the disputed tools, the fragments of memory and myth, the fierce debates between scientists, and the way evidence slips through cracks you didn't know existed, you eventually reach a quiet place. A place where certainty grows thin. A place where you're left with something that isn't proof, isn't denial, isn't fantasy, and isn't fact. It's a possibility, small, steady, and persistent. A possibility that says, maybe we weren't the first after all. But it doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't arrive with a dramatic discovery or a revelation that changes everything in a single moment. It arrives gradually with the understanding that the world has been many different worlds, that coastlines have moved more dramatically than any modern landscape can teach us, that entire continents have reshaped themselves, that people lived in places we cannot access today, that knowledge can survive in stories long after it vanishes from the ground, that human creativity appears earlier than our timelines comfortably allow, that our species carries a capacity for invention, organization, and adaptation that feels older than the archaeological record shows. This possibility doesn't require believing in a lost empire with towering cities or advanced technology. It doesn't require imagining machines or monuments or forgotten sciences. It simply asks whether early humans, fully human, with the same brains we have now, might have organized themselves into societies more complex than we currently recognize. Societies that didn't survive long enough or prominently enough for their traces to endure. When you consider how much evidence disappears over tens of thousands of years, the idea becomes less extraordinary. Early societies might have used wood, fiber, clay, leather, or earth, materials that vanish quickly. They might have lived along coastlines that now lie beneath the sea. They might have built structures that were reclaimed by forest, wind, and time. They might have created traditions, techniques, and ways of living that left only the faintest scars on the land. And those scars might look so ordinary today that no one recognizes them for what they once were. People often imagine that if such a civilization existed, we would have found obvious proof. But the world doesn't preserve things evenly. If you walk through a forest or a shoreline today, even a thriving village can disappear within centuries if no one maintains it. Wood rots, clay melts, textiles disintegrate, tools rust into dust, even stone breaks down. The ground absorbs everything eventually. If you returned thousands of years later, you might find a few fragments that make little sense without context. A few stones arranged in a pattern too eroded to interpret. A layer of soil slightly darker than the ones above or below. Some ash, some bone, a chipped tool, nothing that announces itself loudly. Human history is a long stretch of time during which the earth has been endlessly reshaped. Rivers have carved new paths. Volcanoes have buried entire regions. Winds have carried away topsoil. Storms have erased shorelines. Glaciers have swept across continents. Many of the earliest places humans live no longer exist in a recognizable form. What survives is less a complete record than a patchwork of accidents. A cave here, a dry valley there, a rare site spared by erosion, a pocket of sediment preserved by chance. This is one reason archaeologists hesitate to fill in the missing spaces with assumption. They know how fragile the evidence is. They know that absence of proof is not proof of absence. They know that what survives depends on climate, geology, biology, and sheer luck. But they also know that the scientific method requires caution. They need more than hints to rewrite history. They need patterns strong enough to withstand doubt. People outside the field sense something different. They sense that the gaps themselves are meaningful. They see the long silence before agriculture, the sudden leaps in innovation, the overlapping flood myths, the underwater structures, the anomalous tools, and the early hints of complexity that don't fit comfortably into the existing timeline. They wonder whether these scattered pieces might connect into a picture that has not yet fully emerged. This curiosity is not unreasonable. It reflects something the human mind is naturally drawn to. The idea that our story might be bigger than we know, that humanity might have lived through cycles of rise and fall, that knowledge might be older than the surviving record, that the world before the world we remember might have included communities organized in ways we haven't discovered yet. And perhaps the quietest possibility of all is that early humans didn't need to build massive cities or advanced technologies to qualify as a civilization. Maybe their sophistication looked different from what we expect. Maybe it involved complex social structures, extensive oral traditions, cooperative networks, or subtle environmental engineering. Maybe they managed landscapes rather than dominating them. Maybe their knowledge was practical rather than monumental. Maybe their wisdom was adaptive, resilient, and deeply integrated with the world around them. If that kind of civilization existed, it wouldn't leave towering ruins. It would leave faint traces that blend seamlessly into natural formations. It would leave myths compressed into stories. It would leave tools too simple to stand out in a timeline dominated by later advancements. It would leave footprints at the edge of ancient lakes. It would leave hearts buried beneath layers of mud. It would leave memories encoded in rituals. It would leave a possibility. There is also the question of what it means to be first. The word implies a beginning, a foundation, a moment when humans crossed a threshold from simple to complex. But complexity doesn't always follow a straight line. Cultures rise, decline, stabilize, and transform. Knowledge appears, disappears, and reappears. Innovation isn't linear. It's uneven, unpredictable, shaped by climate, population, environment, and chance. The idea that humanity progressed neatly from simple to complex is a teaching model, not a complete reflection of reality. The earliest known civilizations, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, did not appear from nothing. They built on foundations laid by thousands of years of human experimentation. They built on the knowledge of people who shaped tools, organized families, tracked seasons, navigated landscapes, crafted art, and developed oral traditions long before writing existed. If an earlier civilization existed, it might have been part of this foundation. Not a rival to the ancient civilizations we know, but a precursor, a contributing voice rather than a lost empire. This perspective doesn't require believing in lost continents or forgotten technologies. It simply acknowledges that humanity had far more time to explore ways of living than the surviving evidence suggests. 200,000 years of modern human existence is a vast stretch. Our written records cover only the last tiny fraction. Our earlier stone cities cover only slightly more. The rest is unrecorded, unpreserved, or unrecognized. In their unrecorded space, it's not hard to imagine periods of organization that didn't leave durable traces, societies that thrived in coastal plains drowned by rising seas, communities that used perishable materials, cultures that passed down knowledge through stories rather than monuments. None of this contradicts science. It simply expands what we acknowledge as possible. People often ask why archaeology doesn't explore this possibility more openly. The answer is that the field needs evidence, not because the idea is impossible, but because it must maintain standards strong enough to prevent error. Researchers protect the integrity of the timeline because the timeline is fragile. Without careful methods, the past becomes too easy to misinterpret. Archaeology guards against speculation, not because speculation is unwelcome, but because evidence is difficult to distinguish from imagination when time removes most of the clues. Yet the lack of proof does not erase the possibility. It simply sets it aside as a question waiting for more data. And the Earth still holds much that hasn't been found. Forests conceal ancient clearings. Deserts hide buried foundations. Mountains obscure terraces. The deep ocean keeps secrets in silence. Every year, new discoveries extend our understanding of human history, often in ways that surprise researchers. A footprint in a cave, a settlement beneath sand, a tool far older than expected, a layer of charcoal in a place no one expected humans to be. These discoveries don't prove that an early civilization existed, but they remind us that there is still so much we don't know. They remind us that certainty is not the same as completeness. They remind us that most of human memory predates writing by a span so large it's difficult to comprehend. In a world like this, it is reasonable to hold space for quiet possibilities, not as conclusions but as open doors, paths the evidence may eventually take. Imagine for a moment what the first civilization might have looked like if it existed. Not as a mythic place of grandeur, but as a simple community with patterns of life more organized than anything before it. Maybe it emerged in a fertile valley, now buried beneath silt. Maybe it grew along a coastline that slipped beneath the sea after the Ice Age. Maybe it flourished during a warm period and faded during a colder one. Maybe its people had rituals we would recognize, skills we would admire, and ways of understanding the world that would surprise us. Maybe its traces sit in museum drawers, mislabeled or overlooked. Maybe they rest under layers of sand no one has disturbed. Maybe they lie at the bottom of a lake, or beneath a forest, or embedded in a hillside. Maybe they are fragments so small they haven't yet been recognized for what they are. And maybe one day evidence will accumulate enough to bring this possibility into the accepted story, not as a dramatic reveal, but as a gradual shift, another quiet correction in the long process of understanding who we are and where we come from. Until then, the possibility remains steady and patient, not demanding belief, not offering certainty, just reminding us that human history is older, deeper, and more mysterious than the timelines we construct. That we live in a world shaped by eras we barely understand. That time has erased far more than it has preserved, and that somewhere beneath layers of earth, water, and forgetting, the earliest chapters of our story may still be waiting. If those chapters exist, they do not diminish our known history. They enrich it. They add depth to what we already admire. They expand the story of human resilience, creativity, and curiosity. They remind us that our species has always been capable of more than the archaeological record can currently prove. Maybe we weren't the first. Maybe others walked paths now forgotten. Maybe they built, dreamed, and lived in ways that shaped the world we inherited. Maybe their traces remain just out of sight. In the quiet spaces between discoveries, that possibility lives on, not as an answer but as an invitation to keep looking.